You probably know a lot about the Vietnam War in general terms, the names of the battles, what the war meant to Americans, when it was fought. But not only are these narratives flawed in their own way, they often dismiss or even fail to address the more important questions, like, for example, how the Vietnamese came to be communist. This video is about just that, the August Revolution and the First Indochina War, which immediately succeeded it. So, kick back, relax, and let's delve into a bloody civil conflict, colonial brutality, and lots of names I can't pronounce. So Vietnam has existed in some form or another for a very long time, all the way back to around 3000 BCE, although, like a lot of Asian states, these histories are interwoven with mythology. At any rate, Vietnam and the Vietnamese have, for the purposes of history, pretty much always existed. And as far as countries go, Vietnam is in a fantastic position, highly defensible, with a history of self-rule and successfully overthrowing overlords, in this case the ever-present Chinese. Vietnam had met with Europeans before colonists arrived, with Roman merchants and later European merchants like Marco Polo and missionaries from Portugal. These meetings were fairly productive for both sides, failing to establish European power, but still spreading Catholicism and sharing news and discoveries. The Catholicism was a big thing, especially after the expulsion of missionaries from Japan in 1614. The Hocquard was made around this time, being the Romanized writing system still in use today, actually. But it wasn't until the 1660s until the French arrived in Vietnam. The French landed in Vietnam determined to kick the Portuguese out and establish themselves as the new Western patron of Vietnam, which they did within 100 years. At which point the Vietnamese realised these Europeans weren't going anywhere, and their religion was causing destabilising effects on the traditional Confucian-like social system. Their former working relationship grew strained as several emperors, including Ming Ma, snubbed further French contact. In 1825 he would bar further missionaries from entering Vietnam at all, and bring the existing missionaries under his direct supervision. Not unwisely. By this point, though, it was far too little, far too late. After a serious rebellion, Catholicism was banned, and by 1857 enough executions and expulsions had taken place to give the French all the pretext they needed. By September next year, they landed with 14 warships and 3,000 men. They captured Danang, renamed it Touraine, and began a campaign to invade all of Indochina. The Vietnamese were not super down with this plan, even the Catholic ones, and so began another period of resistance. As masters of guerrilla tactics, they poisoned the water supply, killed messengers, harassed supply lines, and generally made life miserable for the French soldiers shipped to Vietnam. It took until the early 1860s for the French to be strong enough to properly subjugate the region. Seeing this, the Emperor Tu Duc signed a peace treaty, the Treaty of Saigon, in June 1862, surrendering the south of Vietnam to France in return for his throne, even if it was a subjugated throne. Resistance to French imperialism carried out inside the Emperor's authority, but his capitulation cost the Vietnamese. For the next 60 years, the French would bleed Indochina dry, keeping a puppet emperor to rule over a kingdom now wrecked by exploitation. And yet, French imperialism was pretty incompetent. They never set out any formal policy on their territory in Indochina, so Vietnam was ruled by many different people with many different ideas, and this lack of oversight was the perfect breeding ground for corruption and brutality, well beyond what was standard. Even speaking the name Vietnam was illegal, as the French tried desperately to dampen the fighting spirit of these people, ideally while working them to death. The French mission, if there was one, was simply that of take as much as we can, then kill the natives until we can take more. Plantations were set up, workers turned to slaves, making rubber or working in mines, All of it in the service of a few wealthy capitalists who probably couldn't even point to Indochina on a map. This situation, only occasionally broken by nationalist rebels, would finally come crashing down during World War II, the Japanese invasion. The Japanese invaded Vietnam in 1940, staying there until the end of the war 5 years later. It was part of their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a nice name for what would essentially be Japan ruling all of East Asia by way of puppet states and sunny flags. After the German occupation of France, the Japanese took action, taking control of the colony within a week and imprisoning or killing the former French rulers. This imperialism actually split the people of Vietnam, some of them openly welcoming a kinder, gentler dictator who was at least the same race. The Japanese aggression would also end up working for the benefit of the communists, but I'll get to that later. For now, it was around this time, a few years after Japanese invasion, the Americans, now backing full independence for Vietnam as part of their strategy, would make a fateful decision, a decision they would come to regret. They would back Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was born Nguyen Sinh Cung in northern Vietnam 1890 to a fairly wealthy educated family. In his teen years, settling in Paris after a few years of menial work and poverty, Ho Chi Minh began to read Marx and Lenin, and by 1919 he was openly lobbying both the US and the post-World War I peace conference to free Vietnam. As a member of the French Communist Party, he was sent to Moscow, where he continued his education, eventually moving on to revolutionary China, where he married Zheng Zuoming and lectured on revolutionary tactics. For years he travelled all around the world, eventually arriving back in Vietnam in 1941, taking control of the Viet Minh, the Revolutionary Army, comprised of a broad alliance with the goal of Vietnamese independence. Ho Chi Minh and his allies bided their time, educating the populace and growing the influence of the Indochina Communist Party. To do this, they put forward a 10-point plan. Number 1. The overthrow of French imperialism, Vietnamese feudalism, and the reactionary bourgeoisie. 2. To make Indochina completely independent. 3. To establish a government of workers, soldiers, and peasants. 4. To confiscate banks and other enterprises belonging to the imperialists and put them under the control of said government. 5. To confiscate all the plantations and property belonging to the imperialists and the Vietnamese reactionary bourgeoisie and distribute them to the poor peasants. 6. To establish an 8-hour working day. 7. To abolish the forced buying of government bonds, the poll tax, and all unjust taxes hitting the poor. 8. To bring democratic freedoms to the masses. 9. To dispense education to all the people. And 10. To recognise and achieve equality between men and women. Soon their time would come. Japan is in retreat. By June, the Viet Minh hold parts of southern Vietnam. Problems with supply limited outward growth, so the Viet Minh instead consolidated and fortified, moving at a slow but steady pace into central Vietnam. By August, 2 nuclear bombs put Japan out of the war. The time of the Viet Minh was here. Ho Chi Minh called for a national uprising on the 10th, and his soldiers from all across the country advanced from their hidden bases and towns in the rural and beautiful countryside. Piece by piece, they overran the major towns and cities, seizing the Japanese arms and fortifications left behind. The Viet Minh gained speed and traction, quickly gaining the cities of Hanoi, Saigon, and Hue, and forcing puppet Emperor Bao Dai to abdicate. Soon after, the Communist Party of Vietnam, a spiritual successor to the original Indochina Communist Party, began to draw up a declaration of independence and committed itself to creating a workers' state. September 2nd, 1945. 400,000 Vietnamese people gathered to hear this declaration. Just a few years earlier, they had been under what seemed like an insurmountable yoke. Yet, despite it all, they had survived, and claimed back their country at that. But this was not the end of French rule over Vietnam. In fact, it was about to come back, guns blazing. The August Revolution was, in relative terms, fast. The Viet Minh managed to take complete control of the country in just a few months. This was mainly because the Japanese had not expected much resistance, so had not repressed or resisted as much as they could have. But also, as mentioned, the natural geography which allowed for militias to form, fight, and then melt away into the landscape. This quick revolution would have its problems, the most pressing of which would be the French. After Allied funds and supplies dwindled, the Americans no longer having a taste for national liberation if the flag was red, the Viet Minh were placed in an awkward position. As part of the peace negotiations, the not communist yet China occupied the north, and the British occupied the south, forcing the abandonment of openly organised communist parties. The British and Chinese refused to negotiate with the Viet Minh, instead regarding the former French colonial government as the official government of Vietnam. On the 22nd of September 1945, the French showed their approval, attacking Saigon and slaughtering the populace. After scattered resistance, the British joined in, shipping in their own colonial troops to help suppress any nascent defiance in the populace. In just a few weeks, the Viet Minh had been routed out of South Vietnam. The Chinese were no better, though, in the north, and Ho Chi Minh reluctantly agreed to a deal brokered by them. The north would remain under communist rule, and the French would keep the south. Neither side wanting to lose more men, the deal was signed in February 1946, but neither side really intended on keeping this peace. The Viet Minh and the French began rapidly consolidating power, ready for the inevitable war, though the Viet Minh found their job a lot easier. After throwing off French tyranny, the people of Vietnam were not readily eager to put the yoke back on, except those who hated the communists so much they were willing to accept any master, and those Vietnamese who had been personally enriched by the French, and thus had a personal stake in their continued domination. Regardless, this truce was officially broken in November, although skirmishes were frequent before this, and the Vietnamese were faced, yet again, with a war for their country, the First Indochina War. The First Indochina War, or the Anti-French War, as it's known by the Vietnamese, was pretty bloody, while no match in barbarity compared to the US-Vietnam War that would come later. Plenty of innocent blood was spilt in this attempt to hold on to colonial power. From the start, the French had bombarded cities and attacked non-combatants. The Viet Minh, to be fair, didn't have any need to kill civilians, but still were remarkably restrained in their attacks on the French. They faced a tough situation, again. Although they had the support of a lot of people, and far outnumbered the imperialist invaders, they lacked weapons and ammunition, most of their troops wielding Japanese arms or even outdated French arms. Van Rinzap's regiment, for example, consisting of 60,000 men, had only 40,000 rifles, and these men were often undertrained and undisciplined. So they went back to the drawing board. They had to analyse the material reality of the situation and come up with a tactic to beat back the French and reclaim their country. Ho Chi Minh, Giap, and other Viet Minh looked at the situation. There was no way to fight any pitched battles, they were hopelessly outclassed in that regard, and trench warfare would be brutal, bloody, and ill-suited to the natural geography. Studying their contemporary, Mao Zedong, and studying their own history, especially the nationalist guerrillas during the first French occupation, the Viet Minh devised a set of guerrilla tactics to push out the French once for all. Sticking to the jungles and the mountains, and setting themselves up inside villages, they won the hearts and minds of the people, forming to attack a base or outflanked French troops before melting back into the civilian population or into the dense brush. This was untenable for the French, so they changed tack and began to assert authority over the lands they did control. They set up a puppet government and armed the South Vietnamese. many of whom were either ideologically opposed to communism or otherwise were secured by false promises of good pay and other such benefits. These troops, supplemented by bandit armies, became the VNA, the Vietnamese National Army. After more skirmishes, it became clear to the Viet Minh that they too would have to switch tactics. The puppet government was now funded by the US, but its funds were dwindling rapidly. So the Viet Minh began to resupply and reform in Laos. The French, seeking a decisive end to this expensive and unpopular war, fortified an airstrip at Dien Bien Phu, right across from the border, quickly becoming a major base of operations. General Giap decided to pull a Hannibal and do what they thought impossible. Dien Bien Phu was well fortified, surrounded by a thick jungle and only reachable through a small and difficult mountain pass or by air. So a whole 1/3 of the Viet Minh, about 50,000, along with many local people and supported by heavy guns and trucks from the USSR and the now communist China, cleared the jungle, built roads, and at an arduous pace set themselves up to besiege the unbesiegeable. They battered the French, their isolation becoming their enemy instead of their friend, and successfully achieved peace, divided by the 17th parallel, on the condition of eventual reunification. Now that never came, but that's a story for another day. For now, against all odds, the Viet Minh had successfully beaten off the forces of a country far larger, far richer, and far more advanced than itself. One wonders why the West even tried again. But for now, the North was finally able to put down their guns and pick up their ploughshares. The revolution barely had time to get on its feet before it was challenged, so let's look at post-Vietnam War Vietnam in contrast to Vietnam now, comparing rule during wartime to rule during peacetime being fairly problematic. So following the destruction of basically non-stop war, the Vietnamese were faced with some real problems. Almost 1 million orphans, 3 million unemployed, and almost 2/3 of all the settlements destroyed. Saigon was an overpopulated slum of a city, and much of the north had been devastated by carpet bombing of civilian and military targets alike. There was no forthcoming foreign aid, and relations with China had broken down, forcing Vietnam to rely on the USSR, which was slowly being destroyed by revisionism. Despite all this, the Vietnamese people, as they have always done, lifted themselves out of the dirt and dust to rebuild. Vietnam began a process of modernising the country through market reforms, which it continues to this day, similar to Cuba from the 90s to the early 21st century, and China today. Under the Communist Party, Vietnam's economy grew steadily at about 8% a year. The average income has increased 11-fold, so it's officially no longer an undeveloped country by 2008. Vietnam now has so much food it's now a leading exporter. Modernising efforts mean industry and services are now 80% of GDP, and poverty is falling at about 4% each year, from 75% in 1986 to below 10% in 2010. Literacy is at 95%, and all the population has access to primary and secondary education, with an increase of university graduates of 9-fold in just 25 years. Diseases which once killed hundreds of thousands have been all but eradicated, and life expectancy is now a very respectable 73. One of the most impressive achievements in this modernisation effort has been the burgeoning IT industry, with 25 million people now having access to the internet. A feat impressive by any standard considering the devastation. There's a lot of work to be done. That's acknowledged by everyone in Vietnam. But the people will free themselves, and they have proven so through every crucible. Long live Ho Chi Minh, long live the Vietnamese people, death to imperialism. Thanks for listening, comrades. This video was specifically requested, so if you want to see a video, just pop it down there in the comments or ask me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to do it because I don't have a life. Apologies to any Vietnamese people with my pronunciation. I know it was terrible. I'm really, really bad at pronunciation. I can't even speak English right.